Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I don't know whether I'm a well-known researcher from a well-known university. Many thanks for the invitation. It's of course a pleasure to talk at a place which is so well-known in vegetation science, and I'm originally actually from my education as a vegetation scientist. Today I will talk about alpine plants in a warming world, and I have a title which is a question: are they particularly threatened or are they well buffered? And as it usually is the case with science and scientific talks, I will not give you a definite answer, of course. But I would at least try to give you some insights into what we are doing here in Vienna with the contribution of, for example, Christoph, but also others here in the room or from this department. So, I think I don't have to convince anybody here in the room that climate change is happening. It's rather the question how large the magnitude of climate change will eventually become. I would say at the moment, this did work a minute ago. But at the moment I would say we are rather on a weak mitigation path, and I assume you would agree with that. So that at least according to this publication here, we are heading more or less towards a temperature climate that is about 3 degrees warmer at the end of this century than it has been in pre-industrial times. This will have a lot of dire consequences, of course, for ourselves, but not only for ourselves, but also for many other living beings on Earth, so for biodiversity, and that's why the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in its first report in 2019, has already ranked climate change among the 5 most important drivers of the current biodiversity crisis. Of course, not every place on Earth and not every ecosystem on Earth will be equally affected by climate change. There are some ecosystems which are perhaps more sensitive and others which are less sensitive. Among the more sensitive ones, usually, at least this is assumed to be the case, is high mountain ecosystems. Are high mountain or alpine ecosystems for mainly 2 reasons. The first reason is, obviously, we have a temperature increase that is increasing with elevation. So-called elevation-dependent warming. It gets warmer the higher you go up. Illustrated, for example, by this paper from Pepin and colleagues from 2015 from the Himalayas, where they have collected data, measured by a certain number of meteorological stations, as you see here on the x-axis, that are measuring at different elevations here on the y-axis. The height of the blue bars give you the elevation at which these meteorological stations are measuring. And as you see on the right-hand axis, the temperature trend, so the warming as compared to pre-industrial levels, depends on the elevation at which these meteorological stations are measured. The higher you go up, the warmer it gets. Second reason why high alpine ecosystems or high mountain ecosystems are usually considered to be especially sensitive to climate warming is this strong and steep temperature gradient that we have here. On global average, mean annual temperatures are decreasing by 0.6 degrees per 100 meter of elevation. As compared, for example, to a latitudinal gradient of around 0.3 degrees per 100 kilometers of latitude. So the climatic gradients are super compressed in mountains, which leads to this well-known sequence of different vegetation belts, ecosystems, and associated species along an elevational gradient in mountains. And the expectation that you have intuitively, if it gets warmer, is that those species which are already living at highest elevations today, they will face prominent, pronounced decline of their suitable area, or they might even go extinct from these particular mountains. This intuitive expectation has been corroborated by so-called species distribution models, which I will not go in any detail. so no methodological stuff here. But these species distribution models, you know, they simulate where a species could exist in the future, for example, when climate warms. And one such distribution modeling exercise we did already quite some time ago. I was involved in this one. We did it for about 2,500 species in 10 different mountain ranges of Europe. And actually what we did is we predicted the change in the size of the suitable areas for these species on these mountains under two different scenarios of the then actual IPCC report. A strong one, A1FI, 5 degrees warming until the end of the century, and a B1, a mild one, about 1.5 to 2 degrees. And the results you see here summarized in terms of the proportion of species on the y-axis that are predicted to lose a certain percentage of their climatically suitable area when it warms under these two scenarios. The red line is the zero line, so a species on the red line has a climatically suitable area as large as it has today in the future. Everything to the left are the losers and to the right are the winners. And you see that especially the species are from highest elevations, the Alpine species, they are predicted to lose a lot. Yeah? Almost 60% of the species in this exercise are predicted to lose more than 80%, so 80 to 100% of their suitable area. So quite dramatic, quite alarming, but what do the data say? Fortunately, there were very wise botanists already in the 19th century who started to collect data on how species are distributed in mountains. They started in particular to look on mountaintop floras, which species are occurring on mountaintops. What you see here is Pitzlina, a mountain in the Swiss Alps. And the uppermost 20 elevational meters of these mountains have already been surveyed in 1835. Guy called Heer. So he made already a list of all the species, which was one species at that time, which occurred on these mountaintops. And then this mountaintop flora has been resurveyed more than 10 times since then. This is, of course, a very good source of analyzing what happens over time, for example, when the climate moves. Pitzlina is a bit of an exception because he's really well researched on, but there are many other summits where you have at least two surveys, one original one and one resurvey. And several years ago, we have collected data on such surveys and resurveys and published a paper where we analyzed these collected data. You see there were a lot of, approximately 300 in total, such summits extending from the Pyrenees to the Icelandic mountains. So most of the boreal and temperate mountain ranges of Europe have been included. And the surveys, the original surveys, were dating back quite substantially to the 19th century. And this data we then analyzed with respect to the number of species that have been found and how this number of species has changed over time. And what we found is this. We have here on the y-axis the richness change in terms of increase or change per year. And on the x-axis you have time. And what you see is that this rate of change was positive almost across the entire observation period. Here we have a large uncertainty in the beginning, so we don't exactly know. But at least since the late 19th century, positive rate of change of species richness, an increase of species richness, which over a long time has been relatively slow, low, speedy but slow inflow of new species, and then it has accelerated quite a bit with the acceleration of warming since the late 1980s. And I also found a significant statistical link between this rate of increase and the rate of climate change, so the warmer it gets, the more species accumulate. Now, you can ask why is this not completely consistent? Is this consistent? It's not consistent with these expectations. strong losses. It's not necessarily contradictory, because you can argue, okay, there are a lot of species coming in more than going out. So species richness alone doesn't tell us a lot whether there are species going extinct also or not. Right, you're right, but a number of people have also looked on this balance of species coming in and going out. And I'll show you again the pixel now. Here Sonja Wiff and colleagues have published a table in 2013 for all the resurveys that have been done on this mountain, for this mountain top flora. And you see the species number has increased substantially from 1 to 16, from 1835 to 2011. But all the species that have already been there in the 19th century are still here. There is not a lot of outflow, there is not a lot of extinctions. It seems to be a story of winners only. Only species coming into this mountain forest. So the question arises why we have this discrepancy between massive predictions, alarming predictions of species loss when climate warms, and in these observations nothing gets lost. It's only newcomers that colonize. The first and maybe most cited explanation for that is, it works now. I just wow. I wonder. The first and perhaps the most often cited explanation is that we have lag times. Yeah? That extinctions are lagged. Yeah? They are already pending, but they are slow to become realized. This is also what we predicted or concluded from a simulation study that we did now already 13 years ago, where we simulated the range dynamics of about 200 species across the European Alps under a climate change scenario. And one of the results was that over time, the percentage of sites that are occupied by a particular species, but at this time of occupancy no longer suitable, climatically increases considerably. Yeah? By the end of the century, or towards the end of the century, 50% of the then existing populations of these species are predicted actually to grow at sites that are no longer climatically suitable to them, so where they perhaps go over time extinct. And we also estimated the time until these extinctions might become realized, and the estimate from these simulations was about 40 years. Median, but with a large fluctuation in some populations taking hundreds of years to become extinct. Second explanation, it has become more popular over the recent years in particular, is that we see something which is called microclimatic buffering. Here the idea is that above the tree line we have a super rugged terrain, many depressions, many ridges, many exposed sites, many sheltered sites, north-facing slopes, south-facing slopes, and so on. And the amount of solar radiation and warmth these particular sites get varies quite a bit. So that at low distances we have a strong difference in the temperature, especially near the ground, immediately above the soil surface or below the surface. And that's what is actually counting, of course, for the alpine species, because they are all low-growing, perennial, mostly herbs or grasses or dwarf shrubs. So what is going on in respect of temperature, in respect to temperature, in the 30 centimeters or so above the ground, is what is really counting for them and what they experience. And this microclimatic variation is actually real. You can nicely illustrate it, for example, with infrared cameras, as this one published by Daniel Scherrer and Christian Körner. On a sunny summer day, you have differences extending over more than 20 degrees on such a slope, on such an alpine slope, surface temperatures. You can also vary soil temperature loggers in and measure seasonal mean temperatures, for example. And again, you find there is a lot of variation on such a slope or in an alpine belt of a particular mountain. For example, not surprisingly, north-facing slopes are of course cooler than warm than south-facing slopes, at least in the northern hemisphere. Now, what has this to do with climate change? The idea here is the idea of microclimatic buffering. You have here this distribution, this empirical distribution of microclimates, here seasonal means, that they measured on this particular alpine belt, on this particular mountain. You see it extends quite over a large range of temperatures from about 5 degrees to about 14 degrees mean seasonal temperature. And then what you can do with this empirical density curve, you can shift it. Shift it to the right, simulating a warming climate. For example, 2 degrees warmer, so you shift it on the x-axis to the right, the entire distribution curve. And what you then see is there is a large overlap between the two curves, the original one and the shifted still, meaning that most of the microclimates that are realized on this slope today will still be realized in the future when it has become 2 degrees warmer. Now only these coldest ones, these coldest 3%, they are completely vanishing. All others are still there. And so the conclusions that these authors draw from that is, oh, well, there's no need actually to move up hundreds of elevation meters when it becomes warmer. I just have to jump around the corner and we'll find a cold microrevolution there where I can survive and have a nice living, even if it becomes warmer. Which is perhaps not the entire story, because what you also see, of course, is that the frequency, the size, habitat size, area of these colder spots decreases quite a bit. Meaning, of course, that we have less cold habitats available, and as we also all know, less habitat area usually means less species that can grow and live there. So the point to make here with all that introduction, the long one, is it seems to be rather easy to understand what happens with alpine vegetation when it gets warmer, but it is in fact much more difficult than it seems. There are a lot of things we don't understand so far, and there are a lot of discrepancies between intuitive expectations and observation. And in response to this, we are now running since almost 5 years a project in Vienna which is called Microclim, and which Stenko already mentioned, and where perhaps some of you at least already know what's going on, because we have a strong workforce contribution from Germany here. And perhaps you have already heard some talks about microclim results here. To avoid that I bore you too much with repetition, I purposefully selected now from these microclim project studies where most people were not the authors. So I hope repetition is relatively low level. Good. Microclim is a project that tries to understand a bit better what's going on with alpine vegetation when it warms. And it has essentially 2 pillars. First pillar is a continental scale study, including many mountain ranges across Europe. And second one is a landscape scale study which focuses on one particular mountain in the Austrian Alps. Mount Schrankogel, about 3,500 meters, here in Tyrol at the border to Italy. The continental scale study region is identical to the so-called Gloria monitoring network. Maybe some of you have already heard of Gloria. Gloria stands for Global Observation Research Initiative in Alpine Environments. It's a monitoring network of mountaintop floras, in the meantime worldwide, but the origin is European. So the first summits that have been included into this network, which was founded actually by my predecessor in Vienna, the first summits were in Europe, all of them. And this original sample of mountain ranges is also included now in Microclim, where we did a further survey of these monitoring. In short, how this is structured, in each of the mountain ranges, these are the 3 letter abbreviations of mountain ranges, as in, for example, Sierra Nevada, LEO is left Kaori, this is Central Caucasus, and so on and so on. And in each of these mountain ranges, 4 summits have been selected, such that these 4 summits cover the elevational gradient that is realized above the tree line in these mountains. From the tree line to the highest elevations there, ideally the subnival ones, but in some mountain ranges realized subnaval elevations, then it's lower. And in each of these summits, you have 16 1 square meter plots, permanently marked. 16 plots arranged in quartets around the summit, 4 in each cardinal direction, and all of them exactly 5 meters below the summit. And every 7th year, actually, these summits, so these plots, are surveyed. Complete lists of species together with an as exact percentage cover value as possible for each species is collected. The first resurvey in 2008 delivered a result that looked like that. Main result, and it's what you already saw, quite trained species numbers are increasing. On these summits, they're increasing quite rapidly and quite pronouncedly, although with the addition that it's mainly the boreal and temperate mountain ranges that drive this change or increase in species richness, whereas at the Mediterranean summits here to the right, there is not so much increase, but rather a decrease, which we at that time interpreted as a drought effect. Now, as already said, what we did in microclimate, in this monitoring network, we did a further 4th survey in 2022, and now analyzed the data not with a focus on species richness, but on a focus on extinctions. Are there actually extinctions going on? Are species disappearing? Or do we have the situation like on Fitzlina that we only have newcomers come in and nothing gets lost? And the answer is pretty clear, yes, we have a lot of extinctions. A lot of species are disappearing. You see here, again, this mountain range, these assembly of mountain ranges, all that have been included in the study. And you see with the bubbles, the percentage of species on the plots in these mountain ranges that have been detected in 2001, but not redetected in 2022. So you can call it disappearances, you can call it extirpations, you can call it extinctions. I stay for the sake of simplicity, local extinctions here. And overall, I think it was 800 or 900 plots that have been included in this analysis. This rate of disappearance or extinctions was 21%. 21% of the species that have been detected on a plot originally in 2001 not been detected in 2022. With a lot of variation across the mountain ranges, you see the size of the bubbles, as I already mentioned, is symbolizing this percentage. So there seems to be more loss in the Mediterranean than in the other mountain ranges. I will come back to that shortly later on. Now you may argue, yeah, of course, I mean, guys, surveys and researchers, of course, species are overlooked. Disappearance doesn't mean extinction. And I agree, but I have some things to show you, which I hope will convince you this is not only measurement or observation error. First, I make the point that, of course, the data has been cleaned. We didn't simply analyze raw data. We cleaned the data quite scrutinally. For example, we removed all so-called doublings. If, for example, Poa alpina, two species from the same genus have occurred in 2 consecutive surveys. So, for example, Poa alpina in the first, but not in the second, Poa lux in the second, but not in the first. And we have removed all 2 of the species, the whole pair, to avoid that these misdeterminations, these disagreements between consecutive surveyors in terms of determination of particular species would artificially raise the extinction rate. Second, we have also removed some genera that are notoriously difficult to determine, like, for example, Archimilla, Hieracium, or others, Paraxacum, you perhaps all have already encountered as undeterminable yourself. So these are already clear data which gave us these results. And then there are some additional results which, as I said, are not actually interpretable or are not explainable simply by observation or measurement. The first one is that these extinctions have not been randomly distributed over time. So with time, the rate of extinction increased significantly. Of course, there was a lot of fluctuations. So here you see here the data summarized on summit levels. Each of these dots represents a summit. And the gray lines, they link the summit. It looks like spaghetti. It's a bit confused, I have to say, but it's good to show, I think, the measurement of the noise around the trend. And here you see that there are some summits where you have decreasing extinction rates and some summits where you have increasing extinction rates over time. On an average, across all summits and all plots and all regions, the extinction rate was significantly increased. So the further you go on in time, the more extinctions do happen. And not only that, not only with time, what we also did is we calculated for each summit and each survey the change in the temperature that has happened as compared to a baseline temperature in the first half of the 20th century. So how much has each summit warmed until it has been surveyed in a particular year as compared to a baseline temperature. And also this rate of warming was a significant predictor of extinction. So the more summits warmed, the more species released. I make the point again that what you see here are regression coefficient estimates of regressions of as a response variable extinction rate and as a predictor variable these different predictors, time, longitude, latitude, warming. And I again make the point that not only time and not only time, but climate warming in addition is a significant predictor of these extinction rates, and that this is true not only for the plot scale, so if you look at each individual plot that has been monitored, but also if you summarize the data on a summit scale or on the mountain region. On all these levels, the time as well as the climate warming, temperature trend, are significant predictors of the extinction rate. There is no effect of longitude, as you see, and there is an effect of latitude, so the Mediterranean summits have a higher per plot extinction rate, which might have to do with a higher share of annuals there, and hence a higher fluctuation of the species composition on the plot. And I also make the point that these rising extinction rates are occurring, although we still see an increase in the total number of species. The species richness itself is increasing with time, also until 2022. Second, we thought that it's not explainable just by observation errors, overlooked species, is that these extinctions were also not randomly distributed across species. There were some species which were more likely to go extinct than others. To show that, we used an ecological indicator value system that has been invented by the Gloria Group. So the regional experts of each mountain ranges ranked species according to their elevational preferences. Where do they most often occur? In the lowest elevation, the Colline belt, or in the highest elevations, in the Nile or sub-Nile belt. Lower means high number, high value of this ecological indicator value called altitudinal or elevational rank, and low values mean species prefer highest elevation. And what we then did for each 1 square meter plot that has been monitored here, we calculated a relative elevation rank. A relative elevation rank of each species in each plot. So for each plot, we calculated what's the average elevation rank of all the species that occur there, except the focal one. And then we compared this value, we subtracted the value of the focal species from this average. Meaning that if we have a positive value of this relative elevation rank, a species is more cold adapted, more adapted to higher elevations than the average species on the plot. And if this value is negative, the species is more warmth adapted, prefers lower elevations than the average species on the plot. And then we tested if this relative elevation rank has something to do with the extinctions. Species which have particular relative elevational ranks are more likely to go extinct or not. And we found it had. So species that are more adapted to colder conditions than the average species on the plot, they are more likely to go extinct. Cold range outsiders on the plots, they are more likely to go extinct than the other species. Finally, what we also found is, and that's perhaps less surprising, what a species is doing, how a species is behaving before it goes extinct in terms of abundance trends is also a significant predictor of whether it will extinct in a particular survey or not. So if the abundance has declined in the previous surveys, then it's more likely that the species is also going extinct. And the more so, the longer the decline has persisted. It has persisted over two monitoring periods, 14 years, this effect is stronger than if it has only declined over one monitoring period. And this was independent of the original cover of the species. This was an additional predictor in the model. Okay, in summary, what can we learn from this first study I showed you? I think what we can learn is the species extinctions are actually local extinctions are much more frequent than it is usually considered, and this rate is in addition increasing. Cold adapted species face higher extinction risks, and extinction is often preceded by long phases of species decline, which all supports, I think, the idea that the comparatively low incidence of extinctions documented so far has to do with lag phases, with delays in species becoming extinct when the climate becomes unsuitable to them. Good, and now switch to the landscape scale, to Mount Jean-Corel, to a completely different study, but with results that, as you will see, are qualitatively actually well in line with those that I have just shown. On Mount Jean-Corel, what we did is we installed, with the great help of Christoph and other PhDs, a network of 900 observation points, to which we added additional 100 experimental sites on a neighboring mountain. These experimental sites, we transplanted individuals and monitored, especially germination rates. For all these sites, we measured a lot of things, and among other things, we measured so-called vital rates of a substantial number of species. I think originally it was 60, then 2 dropped out, so we were 58. Vital rates, what do I mean with vital rates? I mean we looked on from the years 2001 to 2024 how the cover of this species has changed. Species, I have to say actually not the cover of species but of specimens. We have marked individual plants, more than 6,000 of them, and have followed their cover over time, over the years 2021 to 2024. Which is what I mean with growth. Then we looked on reproductive effort, so on how many flowers they are building. We looked on their survival, how many of these marked individuals survived from one year to the others. And then, exclusively at experimental sites, we looked on germination rates of sown-in seeds, so how many seeds to germinate, and how is the survival of these germinating seeds over time. In addition, on all these, in total 1,000 sites, we collected a number of environmental variables. With every site, there is an associated peak-in temperature logger, which measures at hourly intervals. Then we have installed cameras to monitor the snow lie. So we see how many days, for example, per year a particular site is covered by snow. So the vegetation beyond is also protected against deep frosts. We analyzed soil samples to have some idea about biogeochemical properties. For example, the carbon and the nitrogen content of these soils. And we also, around each of the marked and observed individuals, we measured the biomass of the neighboring vegetation to get an idea on the intensity of interactions with other plants, at least above ground. Yeah? So neighborhood biomass. And then we put that all together, full modeling of course, as always. We built vital rate models. So we built models that show how growth, reproduction, termination, and mortality of the individual species, so for each species one model, was depending on these 4 environmental gradients that we have measured. Yeah? So temperature, snow lie, carbon content of the soil in this case, and neighbor biomass. And all these models then, for each species, we fed into so-called population growth models, integral projection models, just to have this mentioned. And what they give you is, they give you the population growth rate, usually symbolized by this Greek lambda, as a function of the environment, as a function of the 4 environmental variables that we have mentioned. And this then allowed us to project the population growth rates onto our 1,000 sampling sites. And based on these projections, we could make kind of a distinction table where we distinguish between occupied plots, species that are occupied by a species, but have negative projected lambda values. So where populations are predicted to decline. So where populations are, if things do not change, will go extinct at a particular point in time. And then those which are occupied and have lambda values larger than 1, so these are the stable populations. And on the other hand, we have the unoccupied plots, the sites that are not occupied by a particular species at a particular now, but which have predicted positive lambda values, meaning they are colonizable for a species, but species haven't obviously reached them yet. And finally, those that are uncolonized and unsuitable. And we were then in particular interested, how is it with the declining populations? How is it with the populations but have a negative population? And those that are obviously doomed to extinctions under the current conditions. Do they exist? How many of them exist? How is it with them? And the result was actually quite surprising also for us. We found that 70% of the populations that we have sampled are actually having a projected lambda or population growth value that is smaller than 1, so they are declining. That's also under the conditions of 2021 and 2024. Yeah? That's also given in this somewhat messy graph here, which we have a lot of colorful lines. All these lines are representing individual species. And what you see is how over time, on the x-axis, the remaining, currently existing populations do vanish. How fast they are predicted to go extinct if the negative population growth rate that we have projected there would, counterfactually to a certain extent of course, would proceed into the future indefinitely. What you see is that extinctions are for many species predicted to happen relatively quickly, I would say, so within the next decades, within this century at least. But there is also a substantial fraction of populations, as you can see here, where the extinction would take longer than 100 years. Yeah? So where extinctions under the population growth rates that we have now, under the conditions of 21 to 24, would take more than 100 years. So a surprisingly huge extinction depth, which in part will be paid off only slowly. Now the question arises, what drives this extinction depth? And as we are talking about climate change, the intuitive answer is, of course, it has become too warm for these species, too hot. They don't like it too hot, and that's why they're going extinct. We actually checked this by comparing the distribution of temperatures we have measured for those sites where we have projected a positive population growth rate, so the suitable sites, and those sites where the species actually was occurring here in blue, so the occupied sites. The green and the blue lines are the medians of these density distributions, so 50% of the of the measured microclimatic values are smaller and 50% are higher. And then you can look on the difference between the two, and it gives you an idea how much warmer or colder, in this case warmer, the occupied sites are as compared to those where we have suitable conditions, positive population. In this case, Ranunculus virasi, we have the occupied sites 1.2 degrees warmer than the suitable sites. And this we did for all species, and of course you have quite some fluctuation. MAT, sorry, on the x-axis is mean annual temperature. We did it for all species, there was a lot of fluctuation, but the median across all species is quite similar to Ranunculus virasi, so about 1.2 degrees warmer. Are the occupied sites then those are suitable, which seems to be actually corroborating the idea that it has become too hot for these species. They go extinct because they don't like this warm temperature anymore. Yeah, but then we digged a bit deeper into the data and found some interesting stuff which is not congruent with this idea. What we did is we manipulated the measured values of these four environmental variables: the temperature, snow cover, soil cover. Biomass, we manipulated by increasing it artificially in the computer by one standard deviation of the measured variables, or by decreasing by one standard deviation. And this bit we did for each variable in turn, so the other three were always kept constant, and only one was varied or manipulated. And now what you would intuitively expect, okay, if it's still warmer, extinction depth will rise still. If I make it colder, so if I reduce more or less, or redo climate change, climate warming, extinction depth will get less. And that's actually not what we saw. We saw if we increase temperature by one standard deviation, nothing has happened with the extinction depth. And if you decrease temperature, colder again, extinction depth is increasing. Get even more extinctions. Quite unintuitive at the first glance, but look at the other variables. What you see is snow cover, if you increase it, the extinction depth is decreasing. If you decrease it, the extinction depth is increasing. And even more so, biomass. If you increase it, the extinction depth is rising quite a bit, and if you decrease it, extinction depth is decreasing quite a bit. So what this result shows us that the extinctions that we predict to end, they are obviously not driven by the rising temperatures themselves, but rather by indirect effects of this rising temperature. Vegetation gets more productive when it becomes warmer, and snow protection for those species who are sensitive frost early in the growing season is reduced because there is less snow line, earlier snow melt. And this probably drives the extinction that much more than the rising temperature itself. In line with that, we also found that species which have traits that are usually associated with low competitive ability or with high frost sensitivity or protection or dependence on protection by a long snow cover, they are those which are predicted to go extinct fastest. You see here, index of competitiveness derived from leaf traits, mean vegetation height, mean seed mass. If these are low, then the species is assumed to have low competitive abilities. And you see also there's low values in brown. They make that the species, if it has these traits, goes extinct faster than those which have blue values, high values of these traits. Same is true for snow cover optimums. The species which need a long protection of snow cover are going extinct faster. Species which are more sensitive to frost during the growth period, not in winter, but when they are active, they are going extinct faster, and also species which have a low temperature optimum, like cold, they go extinct faster, perhaps because these species are also usually those which have low competitive abilities. Yeah, so in summary, what we can learn, I think, from that second study, that extinction depth indeed is quite widespread, at least in the system we have studied, and I don't see a good argument why it shouldn't be similar in many other mountains, at least of the European Alps. Time to extinction is of course long, decades often, and sometimes even centuries. Drivers are, and that's perhaps the most surprising result here, drivers are not temperature itself mainly, but indirect effects of warming, like the shortened snow cover, like the increased competitive situation the species face, and the low competitive frost, intolerant, frost sensitive, and the snow dependent species are predicted to climb faster. So in total, I would say this is pretty much qualitatively in line with the results of the first study I presented. So we have a lot of extinctions, or pending at least, and we have long lag times. So the idea that the extinctions that are predicted by the models are simply slow to come is well corroborated by these results. Finally, what is about microclimate? The project is named microclimate, and we haven't heard yet much about the effect of microclimate, climatic variation, on what happens with alpine vegetation when it warms. And this is the chapter where I have the least good answer maybe yet, but at least I have to show you something which makes us maybe have already heard presentation of Christoph, and also doubts have been raised whether this microclimatic buffering is so effective. I show you something else here, which also raises doubt on how important this microclimatic variation actually is. I return to the continental scale study here. So the Gloria monitoring network, which is actually quite suitable for studying that, because you have two things here. You have a long macroclimatic gradient. So you have mountain ranges that span the entire gradient from Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean, to boreal, or even polar biomes, polar mountain ranges. And you have associated, which each quartet of 1 square meter plots that is monitored, again a soil temperature logger, same type as we used on Sharm. So you have a nice possibility to compare how microclimatic versus macroclimatic trends over the last 20 years have affected what is going on in alpine vegetation. And here I don't focus now on species richness or extinction rates, I focus on species composition changes, namely so-called thermophilization, which means a change in the composition of species towards a higher share of species that prefer warmer temperatures. So more warm-adapted species going into the community, and the cold-adapted ones losing in abundance or vanishing from community. We used in this study again this elevational rank system, so these ecological indicator values specifically tailored to the Gloria species, and we calculated for each 1 square meter plot in each survey the mean elevational rank of all the species that have been recorded there. And then we were expecting, of course, that over time these elevational ranks would shift towards higher values, towards warmer conditions, or towards a species composition that indicates that the temperature has warmed. And this is actually what we really found. Not in each and every plot, but on average, this elevational rank has changed over time towards warmer conditions, as indicated here by this dashed line. And this shift has occurred towards warmer conditions at almost 2/3 of the plots, while in 1/3 the contrary was the case. So overall, on average, a clear thermophilization trend, as expected. What we also did, we looked on various matrix of temperature, various ways where you can, how you can characterize the temperature. For example, annual temperature, winter temperature, summer temperature, maximum summer temperature, minimum summer temperature, and so on and so on. And we did this both on the macroclimatic and on the microclimatic scale. Macroclimatic changes were derived from climatic maps that are interpolated by different universities and universities, actually working groups from meteorological stations all across Europe. You get on a map, for example, for monthly temperature of each year over Europe, and from that you can calculate how the macroclimate, air temperature of the summits has changed over time. And the microclimatic changes were derived from the soil temperature loggers that were buried with these quartets of 1 square meter plots. Then first we had a look how macroclimatic changes and microclimatic changes are related to each other. And surprisingly we found that this relationship was not too strong. There were of course positive correlations, so by trend, when you become warmer in terms of macroclimate, air temperature, you always also become warmer in terms of soil temperature. But if you look at the correlation coefficients, they are rather low. There's quite some spread indicating that perhaps on the microclimatic scale there's going on something a bit different than on the macroclimatic scale. And also offering the opportunity, the hope, that what is going on the microclimatic scale on site is explaining what you see on the microclimatic scale, what you see in the local communities that you observe, better than these interpolated maps of macroclimate will predict. Actually, what we found was completely different. We found first, you see here again regression coefficient estimates on the x-axis. If the standard errors do not overlap with this zero line, then the regression coefficients are significant statistically, and we did in addition correction for multiple testing. And what turns out that from all these matrix here, mean annual temperature, summer temperature, minute and minimum temperatures, and so on, only one, and that only on the macroclimatic scale, turned out to be significantly positively correlated with thermophilization rates. So the higher, the warmer it has become, the more thermophilization we have observed. And even that one explained only a very small fraction of the variation in thermophilization rate across all the plots, so only about 2%. And microclimatic change was even worse. Actually nothing. No signal at all. What does it mean? Does it mean that this thermophilization a completely random process? No, that's not the case. I mean, what we did then in addition is we fitted multiple regression models, which always included one metric of climatic change, either macroclimatic or microclimatic change, and additional variables. In particular, three ones that I show here. Colonization potential is a bit of a misnomer. What it actually describes is how does the vegetation around a particular 1 square meter monitoring plot look like? How many warm adapted species do you have there that can potentially colonize this 1 square meter plot? And then two variables that should be associated with the ease of colonization. If you have a lot of grog and scree in a plot, it's much more difficult to colonize the plot. And if you have a lot of bare ground cover, so open soil, no competition, it should be easier to colonize. And what you see again are the regression coefficients estimates here across all the models we fit. In 10 of the, in total it was 20. In 10 of them there was one macroclimatic rate. In 10 of them there was one microclimatic rate. And in all of the 20 were these additional covariates. And these are density distributions of the regression estimates in these 10 or 20 models. And on the right-hand side, you see the associated test statistic value, set value, with a dashed line giving you the significance threshold. So everything which is to the right, if you have the hypothesis that more of that fosters a thermophilization, or to the left, if you have the hypothesis that more of them hinders the thermophilization, is significant. So what do you see actually, to make it short? What you see is macroclimate and microclimate doesn't explain a lot, as we already have seen in the preceding slide, but these other three variables, they do. They explain quite a bit of the variability, especially this, let's say, source composition, this colonization potential, which explains 30% almost of the variability in the thermophilization rate across these, I don't know, 800 plots. And also rock and scree cover and bare ground cover were always significant, as you see on the right-hand side, and they explained, not too much, but much more, I would say, than macro and microclimatic trends. Bare ground cover about 8% of the variation, and rock and scree cover a bit more than 1% of the variation. So what these results are suggesting is that the effect of climate change on the thermophilization or species composition change of the Alpine vegetation in a particular direction, which of course is real, is on the local scale obviously overwhelmed by many, many specific conditions of each individual plot, which are more important for what's happening there in species turnover than the amount of warming that we have observed so far. Good. To come to an end, what I think we can learn from all what I have shown is, and I repeat of course a bit what we have already said, that local extinctions of alpine plants are more frequent than usually thought, and increasing in frequency, and in addition, this is not in the Fahnenstange. I don't know what it is in English, so it's going on. Yeah? There are a lot more extinctions pending. Lag times are a plausible explanation for the often stated discrepancy between observed and expected extinctions, and these lag times can be pronounced. Interestingly, and to our own surprise, warming itself is perhaps not the main driver of the extinctions, but changes that are associated with warming, like increased compatibility, like reduced snow cover, and maybe also driven in part by other anthropogenic drivers like nitrogen deposition, which also increase the productivity of this vegetation, are more important than simply warmer conditions. At a micro scale, at the scale of one individual community, the individual site conditions, the peculiarity of the situation of this particular community is obviously so strong that it overwhelms often the climatic signal, including neutral processes, neutral phenomena, like how many propagules come to a particular community from the surrounding. And obviously also, this is like my personal conclusion from the last study, these peculiarities, they are much more important than the difference between what is going on the macroclimate and on the microclimate scale for the changes in Alpine vegetation. Good, with that I'm at the end, but I wanted to make the point that these microclim results, they are really a huge collaborative effort. Many people, and perhaps more than they are here in the room, have contributed to these results. Postdocs, senior scientists, PhD students, master students, colleagues and field workers. I didn't count them, but certainly about 50 people. And without them, it wouldn't have been possible to collect such a large data set, which allows for detailed analysis. Many thanks to all of them. And finally, of course, also thanks to the funding agencies and to you for your attention. And again, thank you for your participation.
Many thanks for this very nice talk. I impressive how complex the research is, because this connectivity between large scale and this micro size is amazing for me. Yeah. So let's open the time for the discussion. So, yeah, better.
Okay, just try to this picture. Can you tell me what is the, let's say, physiological tree line in this mountain? Not
Which elevation? You mean? Oh.
no tree line. Where one can found trees, for example, 500 years ago.
How high?
Yeah. Not now, but in the past.
I think it would here be around 2,300 meters. But we have a bit of a special situation here, because the valley down here, it is perhaps a cold air pool, so that you have no forest, and I think that's in part at least natural, down to 2,100 meters.
Yeah, so it's not the part of mountain is not deforested in the past 100 years.
No, there is no evidence of any forest.
It's not grazed
research.
or it's not. It doesn't serve as a pasture.
As a what?
As a pasture for grazing.
Yeah, it partly does. It could be that some of the lower slopes have centuries to the past being covered by forests. But these are areas which are used for pasturing actually since millennia. So if there had been a forest, and I'm not sure whether it was the case and how much there has been, it was certainly a long time ago.
Okay, thank you, Stefan, for a very nice talk, and especially for the explanation in the introduction of this, let's say, large scale and small scale of the research of this microclimate buffering. But actually, I have a question on this extinction rates, on the Gloria plots, that if you focus just on extinctions, the disappearance of a species, then actually, even if there is any kind of dynamic, which can be neutral, then you can still see actually extinction because you only focus on extinctions. Yeah. So you then presented very convincing evidence that this is probably not the case, but still, could this play a role?
For sure. I mean, some of these disappearances are observer errors.
Yeah.
Some of them are neutral damage. Completely sure. How much of this 21% are attributable to the one or the other, I don't know. But for sure, it's not everything, because otherwise we wouldn't see what we have seen.
Yeah.
It's hard to make
Yeah.
an estimate,
Yeah.
but I mean, I have read a bit of literature and observer errors and so on, and my estimate, because also the reviewers have asked that, surprisingly, my estimate was that about, let's say, a third or maybe up to a half of the extinctions are really attributable to observer errors. About a third I have estimated, but it's a super I don't know.
Maybe going back to Petra and then yeah.
So I will follow the question by Jakub. So is there any, let's say, something like a control plot where no climate change will happen? Let's say, to distinguish what's happening normally in a population without climate change, what we are observing now, whether this is really climate change or some, let's say, nature process of species extinction which happens normally. Is it known about that?
Yeah, I never besides without climate change we don't have.
So just
But I see the point. Yeah, of course. I mean, there is certainly random fluctuation. Actually, some species, even if everything remains constant in terms of the environment, we will have some species fully extinct and others popping up. Fully extinct. Of course, there will be a large difference if you look on bacteria, if you look on short-lived insect species, or live on long-lived perennial plants in the upper layer. I think here this fluctuation is much dampened as compared to many other organisms which show such fluctuations. Yeah? But it will nevertheless occur. I agree. But which percentage? Yeah? I don't know. But I'm quite convinced that it is unlikely that we have a bias of these random fluctuations cold adapted species, as we have seen in our data. And I also do not see why this should have increased with climate warming, if it's just the random process and the time. But as said, all of these sources have probably contributed to this 21%, and it's hard to quantify the relative contributions. But part of it is obviously driven by the warming climate. At least correlation is there, and it's pretty significant. Correlation is never causation. But I would in this case see this as a good indication that climate change is right.
Okay, so Mikael, I don't know sure. Yeah? Mikael, yeah, please.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you very much. It was really interesting and inspirative talk. And I have two questions. One of them is just following these two gentlemen. And it's about, there was extension on a plot scale, there was 16 plots. So do you have also data what is happening around the plots? So that the extensions are on a peak level, or how many of these extensions are on a peak level?
How many species get lost for the summit as a whole?
Yes, summit.
This I don't know by heart. We have data also,
Well, you have data.
not only for the 1 square meter plots, but also for the uppermost 10 elevation and meters of each side. And you also see their extinctions, of course, but I don't have these data by hand. I don't know that by heart. This is also why we know how the vegetation around the plot looks like.
Yeah, that was the moment okay, so they have the data around, so it's not just the dynamic at these plots happening. Yeah, absolutely. And the second one was that I was inspired by the last study, that there was a predictor of the thermophilization beyond the temperature. Did you also plan to, would it be possible also rely on the extinction data, like, you are predicting extinction by temperature, but it's possible to predict extinction also by the other parameters? Or you did?
I mean,
like
the
snow.
predictions are always difficult.
Yeah.
Concern reality in the future. I mean, we're trying to do that actually. The problem is a bit. Of course, then if you have a causation that it spans more different knots, let's say, you can make it indirect with the climate, and then you have the snow, and then you have the vegetation. Of course, there's error propagation. You make more errors if you make it more indirect. And it's not so easy to say how snow-like will actually develop if the temperature changes. I mean, you can say for temperature change, we have a lot of scenarios which are more or less reliable. But then, of course, it depends also on precipitation. It depends on the daily distribution of how the temperature will look like in the future, especially in the spring and summer. There's a lot of uncertainty coming in with that. And of course, you can take some scenarios, use some snow models, and do the predictions. Can do that. But of course, the reliability decreases.
So it means that the future might look different, just what the prediction based on the temperature are telling us, because it's, for example, in some summits there is still increase of temperature, but there is some high precipitation for some reason, there's more snow,
Yes.
so then
Absolutely.
it can just completely reshuffle.
Absolutely. I think that the snow will have a big effect. And it's not so clear how this will look like.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it's actually not too surprising that the temperature itself is not so reliable, because I mean, you have all these plants in the botanic garden down here, they didn't grow under this temperature.
So, maybe Joshua.
I was part of the study looking at the functional response of alpine plants to experimental warming in Norway, and we found that among the huge diversity of responses across all the species in the 3 sites, sorting them by graminoids and forbs yielded the most meaningful comparison. Graminoids responded more similarly to warming, so by increasing leaf area or plant height. And I climate change?
We didn't group them into primary small shrubs and forks. That would be perhaps the most suggested grouping here. This we did not, but we used these traits, these functional traits, not only the growth forms, actually no growth forms at all, but a lot of functional traits that are derived from morphological traits, like leaf traits, competitive indexes, right from leaf area index and other, specifically the area and leaf size and other traits, and then we have measured together with the colleague from the Boku several traits, for example, frost sensitivity, water relations. In this, we have correlated with extinctions as I showed. And there seems to be actually a correlation. I mean, they don't explain everything. Explain in total more or less 10% of the predicted extinction rates, but they are significant.
But do you think that
I
could
think I don't
capitalize
think-
more than forks?
My gut feeling would be that there is not a strong difference in between primaries and forks. But we didn't check.
Yeah, Peter.
Yes, I will follow part of this question. So did you observe some differences, let's say, in the genetic settings of the plants? I mean, for example, I would expect that, let's say, sexual species, which generate much more variable progeny, will be better able to adapt to the changes than, let's say, for example, apomictic species. Did you consider this?
No. I mean, apomictic species we don't have in because they're usually difficult to
Okay.
observe.
So another one, maybe let's say allopolyploid, which have heterozygosity, so the progeny will be more viable. So I would expect that they will survive much better because you can find, at any time you can find something which will fit the new environments. So I would expect that these species will be less, let's say, less affected by this change because they can easily adapt compared to the other ones.
I see the point and I agree. You may even see that because we now have already several decades of warming, but we didn't check. We didn't look at that. Information we never tested. Good idea.
So may I have a question to the first part of your talk? You show that in Mediterranean mountains there is a higher extinction rate or high proportion of species. So maybe I missed the interpretation of that. Is it because some abiotic conditions like solar radiation is higher there? Or is it somehow connected with the species pool of surrounding vegetation which could play a role that's bigger in the Mediterranean and lower in the Scandinavia or something like that? So what will be the interpretation of that?
I mean, it's all only speculation.
Yeah,
I have no
yeah,
data to
So your
to really-
what is your speculation?
Yeah, to really solid.
Hmm?
But with respect to the first results that I've shown, that the species numbers are rather decreasing over the Mediterranean summits, as compared to boreal temperatures, but they're increasing. I assume, and we assume when we wrote the paper, that this has to do with fog. If it gets warmer, the evaporative demand rises, and it by itself also gets drier, which may lead to the fact that some species are vanishing simply because of the fire. And the other point is, and this is what I mentioned shortly when I talked about the extinction rates being higher there. I mean, I assume that, we didn't check that, but I assume that from my knowledge of flora, we have a higher share of annual species in the Mediterranean mountains, which of course have more fluctuations over time. Some years they are not there, only a small population is there, and some years when it's wetter or better more than there. And this will lead to a higher fluctuation of species showing up in the individual surveys, and hence I have a higher extinction rate. Which is not an extinction rate, if it is true, because they are still there and
this is
it's
just a
soil impact.
speculation. Yeah. So you will need longer temporal period. You see. Mhm. Yeah, you sure?
I wonder whether the decrease of the snow cover is more accelerated in the Mediterranean than in the northern latitudes, and that because if within the next 10 or 20 years we lose most of the snow cover, then a lot of the species adapted to this will go too, because suddenly it's a change of 1 to 0, instead of like a gradual decrease.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea also because here in the temperate boreal regions we have more of an increase in precipitation, and in the Mediterranean you have more of a decrease in precipitation. Snow protection gets lost, and of course, especially in the Mediterranean mountains, the melting snow as a source of water during the vegetation period, the early vegetation period, is also important.
Thank you. So, Batja?
And thank you for a very nice talk. It must be wonderful field work. And at least on the pictures.
Listen.
Sunny days.
And I also have a question about these Mediterranean regions. So, yeah, the extinctions are highest in these Mediterranean mountain ranges, and I don't even know if they share more or less similar species pools, but are these species mostly the same species that are going extinct in these mountain ranges, or are some species, is it completely different from the other?
Good question. I have no answer to that.
Same
But in principle, there is quite some difference among the species pools of the
Mm-hmm.
And my limited knowledge of the Mediterranean flora is also that the species pools, for example, of Crete in Spain are almost completely different. So I wouldn't expect that there is a lot of similar species, or same species.
Yeah, I was
Maybe
wondering
species from
if
the
they
same
are.
genera, maybe species that are similar in traits, but not distinct.
I was wondering because, yeah, if these extinctions are so high in Mediterranean regions, if some species are in fact endangered by, threatened by extinction, like real complete extinction.
I mean, there are some endemics, of course, especially in Crete Islands. Yeah, and in the long run, they might.
So, yeah, maybe again Peter and then Michael. So let's continue in the same way.
Okay. Maybe one more. One of the important effects of climate change is some climate extremity and some prolonged duration of droughts and so on. Is it something like that seen in the mountains, like let's say prolonged periods of drought, which will affect the plants? Because you are always speaking about mean temperature and so on, etc., or some minima maxima. So did you observe something like that? And how much important is it for understanding this change in plant frequency?
You look at it. So I cannot give you an answer because we haven't analyzed that.
And is there something
I
that's
assume,
empirical?
I mean, from seeing the field experience, for example, we had one relatively dry year, little snow in winter, and then early snow melt and little rainfall, and at least it has had a very strong effect on the productivity of vegetation. I'm not so sure whether it had a strong effect on the mortality of the species. I don't think so, but the growth was really of the target species that we monitor, but also of the vegetation. So I think that can have an effect, and if it is repeatedly occurring, you have many such drought phases in consecutive years, perhaps also has an effect on the distribution of the species. Whereby I have to say that, for example, Stefan Dullinger, which is more as the Pope of Alpine plant ecology, says in temperate and in boreal mountains we have no water shortage yet, not at all in the Alpine areas. Which of course, again, is perhaps an average, because there are many also sites with a very shallow soil that perhaps are already endangered by water.
Did you look at species association or interactions at the plot scale? I mean, one of them which vanished is more likely
you need a bit of time there.
Sure.
Because in the species, even if it is competitive jumps in these areas where everything is going super slow, it will not be competitive for the first 10 or 20 years. Build up.
Is there any rationale behind the choice of these plots? Somebody just walk, climb the hill, and okay, this was nice. Let's stop here.
Actually, these are so-called static line we use a couple of topographic predictors mainly, and then in addition accessibility. So these slopes, for example, are simply too dangerous to climb.
Oh,
Yeah,
there are some even more.
So when you measured your vital rate or this vitality of the species, did you measure only perennial species or do you have also annual species in your plots? No, just perennial.
There are hardly any other species. And if they are very good. Must be.
Some papaya maybe or something like that could be some.
Atlases, Atlases, they're right.
So, you're sure?
The question of grazing, we didn't really get to the point. Are there cows? Or
Yeah, there are cows. There are cows on part of the mountain. So, for example, here in this area there are cows.
because this will.
And there are sheep everywhere. And those chamois and sheep, not so many. Chamois and ibex.
Because the management will have an effect on the vegetation patterns, right? It's probably going to be difficult to account for it.
Yes, on some of the points this is the case. Although you have to say, I mean, the cows are there for at each place, I would say 2 or 3 weeks. So it's very extensive. But you see, especially here, we have a moraine. There was a glacier in the 19th century, and you have a moraine. And on this side of the moraine, you see really that they are heavily grazing.
Yeah.
On other places, it's not so good.
The cow could theoretically eat your target's grass.
But actually, they behave well.
So, yeah,
Thank you for the talk. So the news are generally like pretty bad now. All the predictions are quite drastic in 100 years, 200 years. So what can we do? These habitats are quite well. They have this problem of narrowing down.
Yeah, that's the discussion what can we do. We all know what we can do individually. We can do a few things individually. Fly less, we can drive less by car, we can eat no meat, and so on and so on. And we can vote for the right parties, right? In elections. But usually take it seriously because of the big changes will done in politics and by ourselves.
So you don't have any contacts to the Austrian government?
Sorry?
You don't have any contacts to the Austrian government?
Contact to the Alpine government? No, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. I'm sure they won't be listening to me anyway.
yeah, better.
If you have told us that there has been a glacier in the, let's say, 500 years, so the vegetation is relatively young compared to the other parts. So isn't some, well, what about if the extinctions are happening there as a nature process of, let's say, transformation of the vegetation or the succession? Is there something like that? Like succession to some?
That could actually be at some of the sites, yeah. But here we didn't measure the extinction. The extinctions were measured in the monitoring. These are just predictions of how population would grow on these sites when the temperature is as it is today, when the soil is stays as it is today, where the snow cover is as it is today, and we have the name of the biomass. Nothing else. So if you would look at that over a longer time, monitoring what you can to a certain extent at the sites, you might, I assume you see first colonization species, and then maybe in the long future also extinction. Just my observation.
Seeing all these other results like together makes me ask the question: what do you think is now left to be answered? Like, what are the main gaps that needs to be targeted if we want to know what will happen with Alpine plants over next centuries?
So what is the next grant proposal? It's a good time to answer.
I mean, as always, with this research, it opens a lot of additional questions. So actually, what is with snow? I think snow is a big player, which has received much too little attention so far. It's just a hypothesis that we create from what we find here. That snow will have a big effect. We have to substantiate that by more empirical data. If I would have to do another grant proposal in this direction, I would perhaps focus on the role of snow and also of competition. This is something which is often discussed. Of course, plays a role, but there are really few data. Really few good data which shows you these interactions are important. Here we suggest it is the case based on this data. But again, I would say this is one landscape in the world. We need more. And we also need, in general, more ideas of what is going on in other parts of the world. All the European centers. And a lot more. So if I think longer, I will find it.
So maybe I'm closing this official version of discussion, and who wants to continue with the unofficial? So let's stay here or go with us to the department or somewhere to the pub. Yeah. And thank you. Maybe you saw that your topic and your lecture attracted a lot of people because the discussion was, I think, huge. And thank you very much.